How does a wedding turn into a police call and a lesson the whole neighborhood still talks about? Police lights painted the fence in red and blue, and the groom didn't flinch. He walked up in a navy suit, boutonniere neat as a pin, and shook the officers' hands like they were old neighbors. "Evening, Officers Rivera Collins," he said, steady and polite. "You're right on time for dessert." The bride laughed through her veil. Guests tried not to stare. From her porch next door, Susan Whitfield gripped the railing hard enough to whiten her knuckles. She had made the call. She thought there was trouble. Instead, she was watching Tempe's mayor, Christopher Dunmeyer, thank the police for stopping by his backyard wedding. It didn't start with lights or sirens. It started an hour earlier in the late sun, a Saturday that smelled like barbecue sauce and fresh-cut grass. Susan stood at her kitchen window, looking across the fence into a yard laced with string lights and folding chairs. She lived on a cul-de-sac near McClintock Drive in Tempe, the kind of place where everyone waved, kept their hedges neat, and put their trash bins out in a tidy row. She liked order, predictable things, predictable sounds. What rolled in that afternoon, cars, guests in good clothes, a DJ table, felt like a surprise she hadn't ordered. Her husband, Raymond, rinsed a bowl in the sink. "They have permits for that?" he asked, eyebrows up, more curious than upset. "It's a house, not a banquet hall," Susan said. "There are at least 50 people in that yard." "Looks like 30, Raymond said. "Maybe 40, but they're just celebrating? I hear laughs, not shouting." Susan leaned closer to the glass. It wasn't shouting exactly. It was joy turned up to 8. A woman with braids adjusted a floral arch. A kid in tiny suspenders chased bubbles. Men in suits carried trays from the kitchen to the tables. Music drifted over, a clean beat, a love song with a chorus everyone seemed to know. It was nice. But it was also louder than usual, and cars lined both sides of their street like dominoes, pushing the usual space to a sliver. Her phone buzzed. A message from her neighbor group. "Anyone know what's happening at 214? Looks big." Susan typed, then erased. She looked back at the yard. The groom, tall, confident, a calm smile, moved from table to table, checking on older guests, adjusting a tie, picking up a napkin someone dropped. The bride, in a gown that shimmered when she turned, stood with 2 aunties near the patio door, fanning themselves with programs. A man in a chef's apron lifted the lid on a tray, steam curled into the air, and someone yelled, "Save me a second plate, cuz." Raymond dried his hands. "You hungry? We could heat up the lasagna." "I'm not hungry," Susan said, but her stomach answered differently. She couldn't look away. The sound of clinking glass rose up. An uncle tapped a spoon and said, "To love that lasts longer than Arizona summer." The crowd roared. She flinched. "What's the harm?" Raymond said, soft. "It's one evening." "It starts with one evening," she said. "Then it's every weekend. Then parking all over the street. What about fire code? What if something happens and an ambulance can't get through?" Raymond shrugged. "Then we help them move cars. People do that." Susan didn't reply. She watched a woman carry a stack of gifts wrapped in gold paper. She watched a man in a vest string 2 more lanterns along the fence line, the bulbs ticking on one by one. The music switched to a slower track, the kind that makes people sway without thinking. A small girl tugged on the bride's hand and asked, "Can I keep the petals?" The bride lowered to her knees and said, "They're yours, sweetheart." Something stuck in Susan's chest. She wasn't cold. The house was warm. She wasn't angry. Not exactly. It felt like being left out of a joke everyone else got. It felt like a decision had been made and she wasn't asked. She checked the time, 5:42 p.m. Across the street, Mr. Krantz from the corner house dragged his recycling bin back up his driveway, then paused to watch. He waved at the groom, who waved back. 2 teens on bikes rolled by slow rubber against asphalt and called, "Congrats!" The groom thanked them. The teens pedaled off, grinning. Raymond touched her elbow. "Want to sit on the porch? We can listen from out there. It might feel different." "I don't want to listen," she said, quoting with her fingers. "I want to be able to hear my own home." He gave her a look that said he got it, even if he didn't agree. "Okay." A cheer rose when an elder, silver hair, suit sharp as a blade, walked to a microphone. "Family," he began, voice smooth. "We are here to honor a promise. Love doesn't ask for perfect weather, perfect timing, or perfect neighbors. It just asks for room. People laughed at that last line, light and easy. Susan's jaw set. Room. She repeated it like it was a challenge thrown over the fence. Raymond sighed. You could go meet them. Say hello, introduce yourself. That might help. Help what? Help you see them as neighbors, not noise. She considered it. She really did. But then a car idled near their mailbox, the driver scanning for a space that didn't exist. The car rolled over a strip of desert landscaping she'd carefully raked last week, pebbles clicking under the tire. The driver didn't notice. That was the click in her head. Susan grabbed her phone. I'm calling. I'm not trying to start anything. I just want them to keep it reasonable. Raymond frowned. Call who? She didn't answer. She had the non-emergency number saved from when a pack of teenagers set off fireworks in June. Her thumb hovered, then pressed. She lifted the phone to her ear and walked to the front room, where the sound of music thinned. She cleared her throat. When the dispatcher answered, her voice came out calm and polite. The voice she used when she wanted results, not arguments. Hi, she said. This is Susan Whitfield on East Desert Cove. There's a large gathering next door. It's blocking parking, there's amplified music, and it's getting intense. Could someone check it out? The dispatcher asked questions. She answered them. Loud, somewhat. Alcohol? Likely. Fights? None. She didn't lie. She just framed it. When the call ended, she stared at the blank screen for a second, as if it might tell her what would happen next. Raymond stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets. You could still walk over, he said. Say hello. Maybe they'd turn it down if you ask. They shouldn't need me to ask, she said. They should know. Outside, an aunt began clapping a rhythm. The crowd joined in. The groom appeared again near the back gate, hugging a man in uniform, Air Force blues, short haircut, then pointing toward the dessert table. Someone shouted, Mayor, you gotta try the peach cobbler before your wife eats it all. Susan blinked at that word, mayor, but thought it was a joke. She told herself people call anybody mayor when they're popular. She told herself it was just a nickname tossed around at parties. The sun dipped and the first star shouldered through the sky. A breeze moved the lanterns like soft breath. The patrol car would be here soon. She folded a dish towel with clean, hard lines and set it on the counter like that action could settle everything back into place. It didn't. But the first clue that this wasn't a normal noise complaint would arrive with the low crackle of a radio and two officers who already knew the groom by name. By the time the first set of headlights eased into the cul-de-sac, the sky had gone soft purple, the street lamps had clicked on, and the party next door had swelled like a tide against the fence. Susan had retreated to the living room window, peeking through the slats of the blinds just enough to see without being seen. Raymond had taken his plate of lasagna to the den, his way of staying out of it. From her vantage point, she saw everything. A line of guests had formed near the buffet, paper plates bending under the weight of ribs, macaroni salad, and something covered in foil that looked suspiciously like her neighbor's famous cornbread. Kids zipped between tables with glowing wristbands, their laughter mixing with the beat of the music. Every so often, someone would step to the microphone, crack a joke, or tell a story about the couple. Each time, the crowd roared like they were part of a live show. A few feet from the mic, the groom was easy to spot. Broad shoulders, confident posture, suit pressed sharp enough to cut paper. He moved like a man who belonged in the spotlight, shaking hands, pulling people into hugs, clapping them on the back. It wasn't arrogance, it was presence. Susan caught herself watching him too long before reminding herself why she was standing there. Her eyes flicked to the street. Every curb was taken. A white SUV had squeezed into a spot half on the gravel, its back tire kissing the edge of her property. The driver didn't even glance up as he stepped out, adjusting his tie and grabbing a gift bag from the passenger seat. Another sedan slowed, hesitating. The driver rolled his window down, speaking to a woman on the sidewalk holding a foil pan. She pointed toward the end of the street where, Susan was sure, there was no parking left at all. She muttered under her breath, "It's a residential neighborhood, not a stadium lot." In the yard, a song change drew whoops from the younger crowd. The bride and groom clasped hands, stepping onto the grass for their first dance. The music wasn't deafening, but it was full, like it carried weight. Susan pressed her lips together. She could picture the decibel reading climbing on one of those handheld meters she'd seen online. The kitchen light in her own house reflected back her face in the window. Her expression was tight, eyes narrowed, just enough to make her look like she was bracing for something. She turned away. A knock on her front door startled her. She stiffened, then opened it halfway. It was Mrs. Flores from 3 houses down, hair wrapped in a scarf, a plate of food in one hand. "They're having a wedding," Mrs. Flores said, smiling. "Isn't it beautiful? I was dropping off a card. They handed me this plate. Ribs, cornbread, collard greens. Look." She tilted the plate under the porch light. Susan's voice came out flatter than she meant. "That's nice." "You should stop by," Mrs. Flores said. "They're so sweet. And the food, oh my gosh, the cobbler." "I'm fine," Susan cut in, her smile practiced. "Enjoy your night." Mrs. Flores hesitated just long enough to notice the closed body language, then nodded and left. The blinds slipped back into place. From the corner of the room, Raymond's voice floated in. "Was that Mrs. Flores? Did she offer you food?" "She was just excited," Susan said. "Friendly," Raymond corrected. Susan didn't answer. She was watching a patrol car turn onto their street, headlights sweeping over the cars packed on either side. The police vehicle slowed, its radio faint but audible if you were listening for it. Susan's heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the expectation of order being restored. But the patrol car didn't stop immediately. It rolled past her house, the officers scanning the scene with neutral expressions. When they reached the open space by the driveway next door, they pulled in, careful not to block the other vehicles. 2 officers stepped out, one in her mid-30s with an observant gaze, the other a man in his 40s with calm shoulders. They looked like they'd walked into dozens of situations like this. In the yard, the groom looked up mid-laugh, spotted them, and broke into a smile so familiar it was like greeting cousins at a family reunion. He excused himself from his circle and walked toward the gate. Susan frowned. This wasn't the stiff, defensive posture she'd expected from someone about to be warned about a noise complaint. The officers didn't rest their hands on their belts. They didn't even glance toward the speakers. Instead, they reached out, one clasping the groom's hand, the other patting his shoulder. Words were exchanged, but from Susan's distance, she couldn't hear them. She could, however, see the easy body language, the relaxed faces, the kind you don't see when strangers meet under tense circumstances. Raymond walked into the room holding his plate. "That's, not the usual vibe," he said. "No," Susan agreed slowly, and then just barely, through the music and chatter, she heard one of the guests call out, clear enough to make her blink, "Mayor Dunmeyer! They're here for you!" But instead of panic or excuses, the groom simply grinned, as if the police arriving at his wedding was part of the evening's plan. Susan hadn't moved from the window, her hands resting lightly on the blinds, eyes locked on the easy exchange between the groom and the 2 officers. The sound of the word mayor still hung in her mind like a stubborn echo. She knew the name Dunmeyer. It was printed on yard signs every election season. She'd even seen him once, shaking hands at the farmer's market near Mill Avenue. But she had never put together that he lived here, and if she had known, she wasn't sure if it would have stopped her from making the call. When she dialed earlier, it hadn't felt like she was doing anything personal. To her, it was simply about maintaining the neighborhood. People paid good money to live on this street, to have peace after work, to feel like their home was their own. She told herself it wasn't about who was next door, but what was happening there. She could still hear the dispatcher's calm, methodical voice in her head. "Are there any disturbances besides the music?" "No." "Any threats to safety?" "Not that I can see, but there are a lot of people." A lot. She'd hung up certain that when the police came, they'd take one look at the crowd, maybe remind them to keep it down, and that would be the end of it. A small, necessary adjustment. But now she was watching the opposite happen. Officer Rivera, she recognized his name from the embroidered badge, was laughing at something the groom had said. Officer Collins adjusted her duty belt and shook hands with the bride, who was radiant even up close, her veil catching the breeze like it was part of the conversation. Raymond's voice cut into her thoughts. "If you'd walked over earlier, you'd know half the people out there live right in this zip code. They're not strangers." Susan's eyes didn't leave the scene. "I don't care if they're cousins or city council members. It's still a disturbance." Raymond leaned on the doorway, clearly weighing whether to keep talking or let her sit in her certainty. "You're going to be the person who called the cops on the mayor's wedding," he said finally. That made her glance back at him. "That's not what I called about." "Doesn't matter," he said. "That's what everyone's going to hear." The thought landed heavier than she expected. She imagined the story retold in little pieces. She lives right next door. She didn't even knock first. The mayor had to stop his own wedding. Her gaze shifted to Mrs. Flores, who was now seated with a plate on her lap, chatting easily with two guests she clearly didn't know an hour ago. She was laughing, leaning in, part of something. Susan told herself this wasn't about being left out, but the way that image stuck in her mind made her uneasy. Back outside, the officers were still mingling. The groom gestured toward the dessert table, and Collins actually followed him, picking up a fork. Rivera stayed near the mic stand, listening as one of the elders spoke again about family and community. The crowd clapped along. Susan's phone buzzed. A text from one of the neighbors in the group chat. "Guess who just got a police escort at his own wedding?" Followed by a string of laughing emojis. Her stomach turned. That wasn't the kind of reaction she'd expected people to have. Raymond crossed the room, set his empty plate in the sink, and said, "You know, it's not too late to walk over and just make it right." "I didn't do anything wrong," Susan said quickly. "I didn't say you did," he replied, his voice even. "I'm saying, if you don't want to be the story tomorrow, you might want to get ahead of it tonight." She didn't answer. Out the window, Officer Collins was shaking hands with more guests, her smile genuine, her notepad untouched. Rivera clapped the groom's shoulder, then turned to wave at someone in the crowd. There was no sense of urgency, no hint they were going to tell anyone to wrap it up. Susan stepped back from the blinds, the room suddenly too warm. She opened the front door, letting the desert night air push in. From here, she could smell the peach cobbler Mrs. Flores had mentioned. She could hear the music in full, not just the beat, but the lyrics about lasting love and promises kept. She stood there, one foot on the porch, the other still inside. But before she could decide whether to cross the lawn or close the door, Officer Rivera started walking straight toward her house. The sight of Officer Rivera heading in her direction jolted Susan enough that she straightened her shoulders and adjusted her cardigan. She had told herself she'd stay calm if the police wanted to speak with her, state the facts, keep it polite, avoid making it personal. But as Rivera's boots crunched along the gravel, her mind started lining up defenses she hadn't planned to use. Behind him, Officer Collins was laughing with the bride, holding a small paper plate that had clearly come from the dessert table. The bride pointed toward the dance floor, and Collins gave a playful shake of her head as if declining a friendly dare. The scene was disarming. It didn't match the quiet authority Susan expected from a police visit. Rivera stopped at the edge of her walkway. "Mrs. Whitfield?" His tone was calm, his hands resting lightly on his belt, not gripping, just there. "That's me," she replied, staying in the doorway. "I understand you called about a large gathering and some parking issues," he said. His voice carried no accusation, but there was something in the way he phrased it, like they were reviewing a traffic ticket, not an urgent matter. "Yes," Susan said, careful with her words. "It's more than just a few cars. The street is lined up, and some have pulled into the gravel. And the music, well, it carries. I just thought maybe it needed to be addressed." Rivera nodded once, glancing briefly toward the yard next door. "I hear you. From what we can tell, it's a wedding reception. Everyone seems peaceful, nobody's causing trouble, and the vehicles, while a little tight, aren't blocking emergency access." Susan shifted her weight. "So you're not going to—" "Not at this time," he said, his tone still even. "But we did want to check in since you made the call. You're all right otherwise?" The question caught her off guard. "Yes, I like to keep things orderly." "That's fair," Rivera said, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "We'll keep an eye on it as the night goes on. If anything changes, real problems, give us a call. But right now, it's just a celebration." From the yard, someone shouted, "Hey, Rivera, get over here! We got your favorite!" The officer glanced back, clearly recognizing the voice. Susan raised an eyebrow. "You know them?" Rivera gave a short chuckle. "Yeah, the groom's Mayor Dunmeyer. We've worked together on a few community events. He's a good man. This is his big night." For a moment, Susan didn't respond. The words Mayor Dunmeyer suddenly had weight, like they pulled the air tighter between them. She wasn't sure what stung more, that she'd called the police on a wedding, or that she'd unknowingly called them on one of the city's most recognizable figures. Before she could find a way to recover, Collins walked over, wiping her hands on a napkin. "Mrs. Whitfield, hi. Just so you know, they're wrapping up the formal stuff soon. The music will taper off in about an hour. We've let them know to be mindful of the neighborhood." Susan nodded, her throat dry. "All right." Rivera gave her a polite dip of his head. "Enjoy your evening." The two officers turned back toward the party. She watched as Rivera was immediately pulled into a handshake with the groom, who clapped him on the shoulder like they'd been friends for years. Collins handed her empty plate back to someone by the dessert table, accepting a to-go box with a laugh. The whole thing felt less like a call to keep order and more like a reunion. From her doorway, Susan could hear the next song start, a soulful ballad that had couples drifting to the grass, arms looped around each other. She could see Mrs. Flores swaying in place, chatting with a man in a tailored gray suit. Raymond appeared beside her, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He passed her one without a word, sipping his own as they both stood and watched. "You're still thinking about it," he said after a minute. She kept her eyes forward. "It's not how I expected it to go." Raymond's mouth twitched in what might have been the start of a smile. "That's because you thought you were calling about noise. Turns out you called about a wedding. And not just any wedding." Susan took a sip, the bitter heat cutting through her thoughts. She didn't like the feeling of being the one who misread the situation, but she liked even less the way everyone else seemed so connected. But if she thought the awkwardness would fade quietly, she was about to find out that the night still had a spotlight waiting for her. Susan told herself she'd stay inside, maybe put on the TV, and let the rest of the evening pass without another glance toward the yard next door. But the sound of clapping and laughter kept pulling her to the window like a magnet. Curiosity mixed with an odd kind of dread. Not fear, but the kind of discomfort you feel when you know you've already made yourself part of a story you can't rewrite. Through the blinds, she saw the groom step up to the microphone. The music softened, and the crowd turned to face him. He had that calm authority again, the kind that made it seem like he was talking directly to every person in the yard at the same time. "Friends, family, neighbors," he began, his voice warm. "Thank you for being here on what's not just the happiest day of my life, but also the most humbling. Because when you choose a life in public service, you give up a little bit of privacy. And tonight, I'm reminded of just how much community means." The guests applauded, a few calling out, "We love you, Mayor," and 4 more years. He smiled at that, but waved it off. "I was told earlier that someone here was worried about this gathering," he continued. "And I get it. When you see a lot of cars, hear music, and there's a big crowd, you might think, is this going to be trouble?" He paused, scanning the crowd, not accusing, just acknowledging. "But here's what I believe. A community is only as strong as the moments we share, even when they surprise us." Susan's stomach tightened. He wasn't naming her, but it felt like his gaze passed over the fence, right toward her kitchen window. The bride joined him at the mic, slipping her arm through his. "We're grateful to live in a place where neighbors look out for each other," she said, her tone gentle. "And we hope tonight is one of those nights where we all remember what that means." From the other side of the fence, Mrs. Flores clapped harder than anyone. Susan stepped back from the blinds, muttering to herself, "This isn't about me." But her voice lacked conviction. In the yard, Officer Collins was speaking to a small group near the dessert table, her laugh carrying above the music. Rivera had pulled up a chair beside an older man in a cowboy hat, listening intently. There was no sense of lingering on business. They were guests now, even if unofficially. Raymond came up behind her. "You should hear them out there. They're telling stories about when the mayor first ran for office. Sounds like half these people have known him since high school." Susan frowned. "That's nice." Raymond gave her a look. "You know, you could—" "I'm not crashing a wedding," she cut in. "Funny," he said, "because from where I'm standing, they'd probably just hand you a plate and a drink." She didn't answer. A new voice came over the mic, one of the groomsmen introducing a toast. He held his glass high. "To Mayor Dunmeyer and his wife, for reminding us that leadership isn't just about policies, it's about people. And tonight, it's about family." The crowd erupted in cheers. Glasses clinked. Music swelled again. Susan glanced at her phone. A message had popped up from a different neighbor, not the group chat this time, but directly to her. "Was it you who called?" Just curious. She stared at it, her thumbs hovering, then set the phone face down on the counter. No reply. Not yet. From outside came the first notes of a slow, familiar song. Couples moved onto the grass, some barefoot now, swaying together under the string lights. The bride's veil caught the breeze, the groom leaning in to whisper something that made her laugh. And then, clear as day, she heard one of the bridesmaids say to the officers, "Guess the mayor still knows how to work a crowd." Collins grinned. Always did. Susan felt her cheeks warm. She wasn't part of the crowd. She was the person behind the blinds. But the night wasn't over, and before long, the fence between her and that party was going to feel a lot smaller. It happened so fast, Susan didn't have time to step back from the doorway. 1 minute she was standing there with her coffee, the next, Officer Rivera was at her gate again. Only this time, he wasn't alone. The groom, still in his navy suit, boutonniere pinned neat, was walking right beside him. "Evening again," Rivera said easily. "Mayor Dunmire wanted to say hello." The groom's smile was warm but measured, the kind of expression that said he knew exactly why she hadn't been at the party yet. "Mrs. Whitfield, is it?" His voice had that same calm authority she'd heard over the microphone. Susan gripped her mug with both hands. "Yes. Congratulations," she managed. "Thank you," he said, not missing a beat. "I hear you've been our neighbor for a few years now. I'm embarrassed it's taken me this long to introduce myself properly." She shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the directness. "Well, I try to keep to myself." "That's fair," he replied, nodding. "But tonight is special, and I'd hate for it to be remembered for the wrong reasons." His tone was gentle, but there was an unmistakable weight under it. Rivera stepped back a pace, giving them room, but clearly listening. Susan swallowed. "I wasn't trying to ruin anything. I just thought it was getting too much." The mayor studied her for a second, not judgmental, but as if weighing her words carefully. "I get that. We all want our homes to feel peaceful, but sometimes peace isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of good intentions. And that's all tonight is." Susan opened her mouth, but no words came. From the yard, a cheer rose as someone announced the cake cutting. The bride's laughter carried over the fence. "I'd love for you to stop by," the mayor continued, "even for just a minute. Have a slice of cake, meet the people I care about most. They're your neighbors too." Her instinct was to refuse, to retreat behind her blinds. But she could feel Rivera's eyes on her, and she could imagine the headlines if this conversation became gossip. "I appreciate the invitation," she said finally. The mayor smiled, but there was no mistaking the subtext. This was as much about closing a gap as it was about extending kindness. "We'll save you a plate." He and Rivera headed back toward the party, their conversation light, easy. Raymond appeared beside her, leaning on the doorframe. "Well, you just got personally invited by the mayor." Susan exhaled sharply. "I don't know if that was an invitation or a warning." Raymond smirked. "Maybe both." Across the lawn, she could see Collins holding a camera, snapping pictures of the cake cutting. Guests leaned in, cheering, phones in the air. The whole scene was a picture of joy, untouched by the earlier call. But she couldn't ignore the small cluster of eyes that had followed the mayor's path to her door and back again. Mrs. Flores, two of the groomsmen, even the DJ, pausing mid-song. People knew. Maybe not everyone, but enough. Susan closed the door, the sound of the party muffled again. She stood there in the quiet of her own home, coffee cooling in her hands, the scent of barbecue still drifting in through the crack in the window. But if she thought she could ride out the rest of the night unseen, she was about to learn that news travels faster than music in a neighborhood like this. By the next morning, the street was quiet again. The cars were gone, the folding chairs stacked neatly in the mayor's backyard, and the smell of grilled meat had been replaced by the dry scent of desert air. But Susan didn't need the noise to feel the echo of last night. It lingered in her chest like a weight she couldn't quite shake. She was halfway through her coffee when her phone buzzed. A message from the neighborhood group lit up the screen. "Beautiful wedding last night. Congrats to Mayor Dunmire and Rachel. P.S. Shout out to our concerned neighbor for keeping the cops in the loop," followed by a winking emoji. Susan set the phone down, the muscles in her jaw tightening. Raymond, seated across from her with the Sunday paper, caught her expression. "So it's out there." "Apparently," she said flatly. He flipped a page. "Well, at least they're trying to make it sound lighthearted." "That's one way to put it." she muttered. A knock at the door cut through the moment. She opened it to find Mrs. Flores holding a small white bakery box. "Morning. Thought you might like a slice of the wedding cake. They had plenty left over." Susan hesitated, but Mrs. Flores pushed the box gently toward her. "It's chocolate with raspberry. Rachel insisted we share it with the whole street. And yes, she knows about the call." Susan's eyes narrowed slightly. "And she still sent me cake?" Mrs. Flores smiled. She said it wouldn't be much of a wedding if everyone didn't get a piece. There was no malice in her tone, just a matter-of-fact kindness that made Susan's chest tighten. She took the box, murmured a thank you, and closed the door. Raymond peeked over the paper. "That's the kind of gesture you don't ignore." She didn't answer. She set the cake on the counter, lifted the lid, and stared at the perfect swirl of frosting. For reasons she couldn't explain, it made her feel both guilty and oddly relieved. By Monday afternoon, the story had reached farther than the neighborhood. A local blog had posted a short piece, Mayor Dunmire's backyard wedding draws neighbors, police, and praise. The photo at the top showed him and Rachel laughing with officers Rivera and Collins, no sign of tension. But buried in the text was a single line. Police were called to check on the gathering after a nearby resident expressed concerns. The comments section was a mix of congratulations, jokes about crashing the mayor's party, and a few pointed remarks about overreacting. No names, but Susan knew anyone in their cul-de-sac could connect the dots. That evening, while Raymond watered the front yard, Susan stayed inside, glancing out the window every time someone walked by. Some waved like normal. Others didn't look her way at all. She finally stepped out onto the porch just as the mayor himself was coming down the street. No suit this time, just jeans, a t-shirt, and sneakers. He raised a hand in greeting. "Evening, Mrs. Whitfield." She forced a small smile. "Evening." He slowed, but didn't stop. "I meant what I said the other night. Neighbors looking out for each other is a good thing. Maybe next time, instead of a call, you'll just walk over." "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her voice quieter than usual. He nodded once, then continued down the street, waving to a couple walking their dog. Susan watched him go, the weight in her chest shifting into something she couldn't quite name. She thought about the cake still in the fridge. She thought about the look on Rachel's face when she'd thanked the officers for stopping by. But it was what Raymond said later, over dinner, that finally made her stop defending herself in her own mind. Sometimes, the shortest distance between misunderstanding and respect is just a few steps across the lawn. For the rest of the week, Susan kept thinking about those few steps across the lawn. It wasn't the kind of thought that nags at you like guilt, more like the slow, steady hum of realization. She'd gone into Saturday evening convinced she was protecting the peace, convinced she was right to act without asking. And technically, she hadn't broken any rules, but that wasn't the point anymore. Every time she opened the fridge and saw the box of cake, she remembered Mrs. Flores' voice. "She still sent you cake." It wasn't about frosting or flavor. It was about the kind of grace she hadn't extended in return. On Thursday, she carried that same box back across the lawn. The reception tent was gone, the yard almost back to normal, except for a few lanterns still hanging from the fence. Rachel answered the door, barefoot, her hair loose. "I wanted to thank you," Susan said, holding out the cake. "I didn't deserve this, but I appreciate it." Rachel's smile was easy, without hesitation. It was a wedding. Everyone deserves cake. Susan almost laughed at the simplicity of it. They spoke for a few minutes. Nothing dramatic, no apologies demanded. Just a conversation between two people who, until that moment, had lived side by side without really seeing each other. When Susan walked back home, she noticed the street felt different. Not quieter, just less divided. That night, she told Raymond, "Next time, I'll walk over first." He didn't say, "I told you so." He just passed her the salt and nodded like that was enough. And maybe that's the lesson. It's easy to assume the worst when you only look from a distance. But if you take a few steps closer, ask a question, share a moment, you might find the thing you thought was a problem is actually a celebration you were meant to be part of. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Before you judge the noise from someone else's yard, try listening to the music. And if you ever get the chance, have the cake. If you've ever had a misunderstanding with someone, especially a neighbor, don't wait for it to grow into something bigger. Walk over, knock, say hello. You might just turn a fence into a welcome mat.